Okay, I'm pleased to moderate this session. My name is Christine Schwartz, and I'm a PhD student in the sociology department here at UCLA. And we have 4 speakers today who will be discussing data and findings on same-sex couples from the US, Scandinavia, and Western Europe. Here to discuss the US case are Gary Gates, who's a senior research fellow at the Williams Institute and also a co-author of the Gay and Lesbian Atlas, and Walter Schum, a professor of family studies and human services at Kansas State University. And then here to discuss data and findings from Scandinavia and Western Europe are Lee Badgett, who is a visiting professor at the Williams Institute and the author of the book Money, Myths, and Change: The Economic Lives of Lesbians and Gay Men, and Alan Carlson, who is the president of the Howard Center of Family, Religion, and Society, and the author of numerous books, including The Swedish Experiment in Family Politics, The Myrtles and the Interwar Population Crisis, and the forthcoming Conjugal America on the Public Purposes of Marriage. So please help me welcome Gary Gates.
Thank you. I'm going to present some findings actually from work that I've done with 2 colleagues at the Williams Institute, Ho-Ning Lau and Brad Sears, who you met earlier. And I'm going to focus on kind of a subset of the gay population, looking specifically at race and ethnicity within same-sex couples, and talk a little bit about how I think that relates to the whole marriage debate. So, non-white same-sex couples, when we start to explore them in data, and actually one of the difficulties of exploring non-white same-sex couples is we do have limited data on gay people, and often when we have data, it's very small samples that we really can't break apart to examine separately white versus non-white same-sex couples. And so I think the census is a great way to begin this kind of analyses. But when we do so, we reveal a much more nuanced demographic portrait of the gay and lesbian population that perhaps is not so dependent on shows like Will and Grace or Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, which stereotypes, I think, in some ways the gay population as predominantly white, male, and wealthy, and stylish, maybe. But when we look at data and go a little deeper and look at some of the diversity of same-sex couples using the census data, we realize that some of these stereotypes can be challenged. There is quite a bit of racial and ethnic diversity. There's economic disparities, and there's child rearing, which we very rarely see in images of gay people, particularly in the media. And I think that what I'm going to close up with is to point out how I think some of these demographic traits are helping to explain some of the policy trends around marriage, equal marriage rights for same-sex couples. So how do we identify gay and lesbian couples in the census? Well, the most important thing is that census doesn't ask your sexual orientation. Instead, what census does is identify how people in a household are related, or actually how people are related to the person who fills out the form, known as the householder. And you have these choices that I show here, and one of the choices that you can make is calling someone your unmarried partner, or actually calling someone your husband and wife. And the people who chose either a husband, wife, or an unmarried partner, and who were also both of the same sex, we count as gay and lesbian couples. Some of the work I've done has suggested that indeed these same-sex couples are, for the most part, predominantly gay and lesbian couples. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily have to be true in all households, but it's definitely true that they're not roommates or unrelated adults or siblings, because if they were, they would have checked those boxes. Those were other boxes. And the category of unmarried partner was added to the census in 1990 and then was repeated in 2000 for interesting around marriage policies. In 1990, if I checked someone was my husband was changed to a woman. And because they said that can't be possible. In 2000, they said, maybe that is possible. However, the Defense of Marriage Act says that we can't have same-sex married couples, so my husband became an unmarried partner. So we're going to look a bit at California today, although many of these trends aren't that different on the national level. I mean, California is, I think, 16% of the population, something like that. So while it's not completely representative of the country, many of the trends are similar. In California, it is one of the most diverse states around same-sex couples, at least in terms of race and ethnicity. There were 184,000 individuals who were reported to be in same-sex couples, and almost 72,000 of them are not white. Among other states, California ranks 5th in the percentage of non-white among the same-sex couples, 3rd in the percentage of Latinos, and 2nd in the percentage of Asians and Pacific Islanders. So again, with regards to the same-sex couples, California is incredibly diverse. One of the important things to note, though, is that that's because California is diverse in its general population. And one of the things that census reveals for us is how same-sex couples often do mirror the populations where they reside. One of the most interesting things about minority same-sex couples is that in terms of geographic proximity, where they choose to live, we all have an idea that all gay people live in West Hollywood, in the Castro, in Palm Springs. In fact, that's really only a phenomenon of white gay couples. Minority same-sex couples basically live where other minorities live. So what you see on the left-hand chart is what are the counties that have the highest proportions of non-white same-sex couples. And on the right, you see what are the counties that have the highest proportions of non-white households. And the basic story there is those maps look pretty similar. They're really not that different. But let's look at those two maps now for white same-sex couples versus the white population. Those two maps are very different. It's the white same-sex couples who are clustering in a particular way. And that's where you get to see, San Francisco and some of the other locations that are known to be high in the gay population and around the Bay Area there. You'll see that they distribute very differently than the overall white population. And nationally, this is very much true as well. Another way to show this is to look at LA County. These are the census tracts, which is just a small geographic area, where a particular minority predominates. And you'll see that, where Hispanics predominate among same-sex households, so too do Hispanics dominate the yellow in the general population. And virtually for all the minorities, again, those maps look very similar. One of the really important things that I think census points out is that minorities within same-sex couples face the same kinds of economic hardships as minorities in the population. You'll note that in terms of income, minorities, both in different sex and same-sex couples, have lower income than their white counterparts. They also have lower rates of college degrees, with the exception actually of Asians, who in the general population have higher rates than whites. But in general, particularly in same-sex couples, minorities suffer the same disadvantages as other minorities. So the point being gay is not some economic panacea for people, and quite the contrary. Also, and I think this has definite impact on the marriage debate, which is that child rearing and income are negatively associated in same-sex couples. So the more likely you are to have children, be raising children, and you see that child rearing is much more prevalent among minority same-sex couples than among white couples. That's also true nationally. And that those are have the most difficult times economically. So the more likely you are to have children, actually, the lower income you have in same-sex couples. And I think, again, I'll explain in a second why I think that has importance to the marriage debate. While the parents are really diverse racially and ethnically, the children are even more diverse in same-sex couples. Only 30% of the children of same-sex couples in California are white. So 70%, 7 out of 10 of them, and there are about 70,000 children living with same-sex couples in California, only about 3 in 10 are white. The rest are some other racial or ethnic minority. So what does this mean? Well, as California goes, perhaps so goes the nation. I think what these findings begin to evidence is the changes we're seeing in the visible gay and lesbian community. And I use that word visible quite intentionally because obviously being gay or lesbian is something that to a large degree you have to say you are, as opposed to your color of your skin. It's a very different situation. And the visible community is beginning to change in same-sex couples. And if you look at differences between 1990 and 2000 nationally, you begin to see this. And what we see is that this visible community, at least among couples, there is increasing racial and ethnic diversity. Partly as a result of that, there's increasing socio and economic diversity, or socioeconomic status and diversity in that regard in the gay and lesbian community. And there are increasingly more couples with children, which are changes in the family structure and more diversity of that family structure. I would posit that some of those changes going on in the community partly explain why marriage has kind of risen to the top of the mythical gay agenda. In that if we think about what does marriage offer in, whether we decide it's an institution or not, legally marriage offers a variety of things in our society. One of the most important is economic stability for families. It garners certain employment benefits, it garners health care benefits, Social Security, so long-term benefits. It also provides myriad protections for children and broadly a level of social acceptance and recognition. And my argument is that when we look at the racial and ethnic diversity, we see that to a large degree these are the very people who are most in need of the protections that marriage provides. And I think one of the reasons you see within the gay population the elevation of marriage is that it's that diversity that's precisely driving these changes in priorities. I think more and more gay people have different priorities, and one of those is marriage, because marriage garners for them, whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing, they see that marriage garners for them many of the protections that could really benefit them. And I think that this study begins to highlight some of that. And Zach just told me my time is up, so thank you.
Well, I knew I was in trouble when I walked into Gary's office, and compared to mine, it was immaculate. Mine's a huge pile of papers, and I'm known as having the messiest office at Kansas State University. Gary's done a great service by looking at the census data in the way that he has, and I really appreciate that. I fully agree with him that I think the census probably should do a more accurate job of assessing household status. The military probably should do better research in terms of tracking things by sexual orientation. So I agree that there's some limitations there. It reminds me, my father was in the Navy for 36 years and picked up 15 battle stars in World War II, and he was in the Pentagon in the mid-50s, and some congressman asked him to provide data on racial prejudice in the Navy. And he had to say that they couldn't provide any because the Navy had decided to stop collecting racial data in order to keep people from being prejudiced during promotion boards and things like that. So their attempt to, at least the theoretical attempt to protect people, cut out the demographics. And we're kind of in the same position with this. One thing which I think underlies a lot of the material here that probably needs some further look, in addition to differences in educational disparity, which Gary mentions, is the prior marital history of these individuals. Going way back to Kirkpatrick's study in 1981, and it was really Smith's dissertation before that, done at either here at USC, I forget which institution, they found that a lot of lesbian couples involved women who previously had been married and who actually expressed an intent to marry heterosexually in the future. So there's not just diversity in terms of race, but there's diversity in terms of the marital history that people have. And that may account for some of the financial differences, because people that have gone through a divorce, particularly women, are often severely disadvantaged in that process. So that divorce history could account for some of these things that are going on there. I think there was another interesting finding that in the diagram with the bar chart there, if you look at the income levels within each racial group, for most of the cases, the same-gender households are doing better than the different gender households. So there actually does appear, I mean, I hate to call it a stereotype, but there is some support that they're doing well there. As you could see from the chart, which was the scattergram, I thought it was very interesting that the white couples, which had the greatest level of income, averaging nearly $100,000 a year, fewer than 20% of those households actually had children. And yet the households that had much lower incomes were the households that did have children. I just found it very interesting that the folks that had the greatest resources were the people who appeared to be least likely to have children. But I'm suggesting that if you could study the relationship history of the minorities, that you might find they had a different relationship history than the white same-sex households. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just saying it ought to be looked into as another explanation in addition to educational levels. Now, the demographic information is important, and I hope that somebody can refute the following statement I'm going to make, because it could sound inflammatory, and I don't mean to be, so I'm just saying what the data shows. There was some material published about foster parenting and same-gender, opposite-gender perpetrators out of Illinois. And in a previous paper, which I have copies of here, that's coming out shortly in the St. Thomas Law Review, I looked at the gay parenting issues and research and found a number of flaws in it. But I had critiqued Cameron's work in Illinois. So I recreated the data, and I was trying to determine what the child abuse, sexual abuse rates were for what appeared to be same-gender households versus mixed-gender households. But it's difficult to know because we didn't have a percentage of same-gender households, so I had to work with assumptions in this paper. However, Gary was kind enough for the data from New Jersey to provide me the estimate that 0.5% of the foster parent households in New Jersey were same-gender. Now, in California, I suspect that's probably higher, because I think the total number of foster parent households appears to be 100,000, and there appear to be 5,000 or 10,000 same-gender foster parent households. So that's probably a much different figure for California. However, if we applied that percentage to the Illinois data, then we come up with a very much higher rate of child sexual abuse in same-gender households than we have in opposite-gender households. And so I hope somebody takes the challenge of proving that wrong. But either way, the problem is that in most places don't track the type of household that has foster children. So we ultimately really don't know. We're having to live with estimates of things, because that data is just not being kept. Just in my father's day, they didn't keep data on race. One issue which I don't have time to go into here, but I try to always think of things that people have never thought of before, and sometimes that irritates people. I also critique research heavily, and I got a lot of enemies out there, so don't feel alone. One way of looking at this issue, which is not widely accepted in conservative circles, is that, in essence, if you create social equality between same and opposite gender or different gender marriages, I make a case that you're actually institutionalizing a great inequality. So you're actually accomplishing the very opposite of what the intention is. And you can refer to the St. Thomas paper or some of my previous writings if you want to see the argument for that. Again, with the data, that Gary presented here, I think it's interesting that same-sex white couples tended to have higher mean incomes, higher levels of education, and higher levels of employment than different-sex couples. Now, given that, you would probably expect that they'd have higher levels of home ownership because they got more money, more education, etc. But Gary's own data suggests the opposite. He didn't present it here, but you have a chart in your paper. They actually have lower levels of home ownership. And I think that's a curious reversal of what you'd expect. Now, it could be prejudice against gays because maybe they can't purchase homes because there's prejudice that prevents them from doing so. That's one explanation. A more conservative viewpoint might be, for some reason, different gender couples are more willing to, in some sense, invest in a home, perhaps for the sake of children or something, than other people. But it's just a curious reversal of what you'd think. You'd think people that have more of the means to purchase homes would be doing so. The next folks are going to speak to an issue which I mentioned briefly here, but there's a phenomenon called the second demographic transition in some quarters, and so they use Scandinavia to talk about how there may be a correlation between out-of-wedlock births and other changes in the family and changes in same gender relationships, but I'm not going to cover that one. When I had to present the paper, I looked at most of what Gary had been writing, and there's a number of papers on state budgets and gay marriage and benefits there. And real quickly, the most interesting thing I found there was that in many cases, gay couples are getting benefits that married couples wouldn't get because there isn't a means testing going on for roommates. But there is a means testing going on for married couples. So that's kind of a reverse advantage of not being married in a sense. And so Gary's argument is the states would save money because a number of people would no longer be eligible for state benefits if indeed they were married. I'm kind of surprised the money-hungry state legislators haven't figured that loophole out yet. I mean, in Kansas, they're always looking for ways to, keep money from being spent. Also, Gary's written some on gays and lesbians in the military, and I've written some in that area as well. I noticed in his report, it was interesting, I was in the Army Reserve or Army Guard or the Army for 34 years. I noted that there are only 3 officers per year on average being discharged under the don't ask, don't tell policy in the Army. Much higher rates of discharge in the other services. And I wasn't quite sure why that was. It's an interesting thing to consider. When I have looked at this issue, Humphrey wrote a book about 1989, I believe, and she had case studies of homosexuals who had been discharged from the military. And in 2/3 of those cases, they had actually violated other regulations besides something dealing with homosexuality. So I think it's a measurement issue when somebody's discharged for DADT. Is that because of their revealing their gay identity, or did they do something else and it was just easier for the Army to get rid of the person? I had a case when I was a company commander in Indiana. I happened to have a unit in the second highest populated KKK community in the state. And so I had KKK members in my unit. And I didn't like them being there. And I told everybody, if somebody does something to a black person in my unit, that it's like doing it to me. So I wasn't too popular with some of them either. Nevertheless, it's very hard to get people out for being KKK members. The FBI refused to cooperate with me. But I finally did get one of them out because he was AWOL during annual training, so I got him busted out of the system for that. But the underlying reason was I suspected he was KKK. And that's why I busted him. But if you had checked to see why he went out, you would have said being AWOL, but it was really because I was going after him because he was KKK. So I don't know, in some cases that people may be discharged for homosexuality, but it may really be some other reason that's involved. But there could be people who were gay and they get rid of them because they're gay, but they really had some other excuse. So it's hard to know exactly what the figures mean. One of the last issue in terms of gays in the military I would address from Gary's research is that there is this issue of how you're going to deal with sexual behavior and sexual harassment in the military. It's not clear to me that the military is doing a good job either heterosexually or homosexually with this. I have a quote from Humphrey's book, A Gay Colonel, made this quote here, in the gay culture particularly, you do that, we do that. We get physical, we get real promiscuous, and there are outlets and places where you can go and don't even have to know your partner's name. Now, this is a quote from a gay colonel, high authority. As a unit commander, I don't want that kind of behavior in my unit from somebody, whether they're heterosexual, gay, or what. So I'm not particularly personally opposed to gays in the military, but I am opposed to people engaging in promiscuous behavior out of the unit, because that really leads to all kind of conflicting loyalties between those people in the military. And in the military, you have to have people having a primary loyalty to their buddies and to the unit, or, you know, when the push comes to shove, they may be, you know, running back over the hill. Okay, those are just some of the comments I have on it. In general, I really appreciate Gary's research and wish him well in his pursuit of it.
I'll just make a couple comments from what Walter said. Thank you very much for the very kind words. Interesting about, he commented about the issue of looking at prior marital status. That now we're getting into really, really census geek talk here, but it's a very bizarre outcropping of the Defense of Marriage Act that you actually can't look at prior marital status in the census. And that's because, remember I told you that group of people who called someone of the same sex their husband or wife? If they also said that they were currently married, census said, no, you're not. And so they changed you to just something else. So it means that particularly among the same-sex couples, almost half of them had their marital status altered randomly by the census. It also meant that heterosexual unmarried partners, so if I'm a married man who's left my wife and I'm living with a woman who I consider my unmarried partner, census did not allow me to say that I was currently married. They say that, you know, they may do something else. So sadly, with regards to same-sex couples, because of that decision, you can't actually rely on the variable that looks at prior marital status, so whether or not you were married before. However, I do agree with Walter that I think perhaps, particularly among minorities, if you do think that there's additional stigma in those communities, they perhaps come out later in life and are perhaps more likely to have been married earlier and then perhaps more likely to have children. So I do think that's a reasonable issue. Sadly, I'm not sure that we can get at it very much with census. With regards to household income, I think we always need to be extremely careful with those comparisons with in same-sex couple households, because heterosexual coupled households have the income of a man and a woman. Half of same-sex couples households include the income of a man and a man. By definition in our society, those household incomes with two men are going to be higher, no matter how you do it. It's just the way the mean is higher. And so it's not completely fair to say that same-sex couples, I mean, yes, they have higher household income, but that's not really anything to do about being gay. It's about having two men in the household. Lower home ownership, I think two factors play into that for same-sex couples. One is they're much more mobile, so they're less likely than other couples to have lived in their community for the same period of time. That could affect home ownership rates. They're also more urban than other households. Not a lot more, but still more. Home ownership rates in urban areas are generally lower. And just my last comment about the outlets where you can go to have sex where people don't know your name. I would argue that heterosexuals invented that concept. It's called brothels. So I hardly think that's something that's unique to the gay community. So thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the Scandinavia and Western Europe portion of our session, and we'll begin with Lee Badgett.
Okay, well, I've got more data. It's a little bit different, but lucky you get two PowerPoint geeks on one panel. And so I'm going to talk about what's been going on in Europe. And a lot's been going on there. So in 1989, quite a long time ago now, Denmark was the first country to grant something a lot like marriage that they called registered partnership to same-sex couples. And since then, all of the other Nordic countries, the darker countries up there, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, have implemented something very similar. Shortly after that, the Netherlands did, and then since then it's been a cascade of countries in Europe and one in North America, Canada, who have started to grant some kind of marriage, either explicit marriage rights in Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and something very close to that in all these other countries. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about those other countries, because I think what's valuable about the data from Europe is that it's kind of a social laboratory to ask a question that has been on many people's minds: will gay people change marriage? This is the central question of a book that I'm working on. On one hand, some people say the sky didn't fall. All those countries continue to exist. They're very productive, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the harm? On the other side, a guy named Stanley Kurtz and some Dutch scholars have started to criticize, to point specifically to the Scandinavian experience and say, actually, same-sex marriage virtually ended heterosexual marriage in those countries because it drove a wedge between procreation or parenthood and marriage. And driving that wedge, we can see from the higher non-marital birth rates. We can see this because there's more cohabitation without marriage. So what I want to talk about today, just to start with, is starting from this angle: what's happened to heterosexual marriage behavior as a result of same-sex couples getting rights in these countries. And I have 3 charts for you. That top, the orange circles are the United States. Just to point out to you, in Denmark, 1989. So going way back to here, Denmark are these blue sort of sideways squares here. And what you see is marriage rates have actually increased somewhat. This is heterosexual marriage, all of these are. In other countries that have these laws, the same thing kind of happened. Although there was a long decline in the rate of marriage for many years beforehand, once these laws started being passed sometime in the mid-90s, we either see roughly similar marriage rates or actually in some cases higher marriage rates. If you want to see some evidence of what policy impacts really look like, take a look at this. This is Sweden. The spike in the marriage rates in 1989 was a very clear behavioral response to the abolishment of widows' pensions that was effective the following year. So 1989 was a big marriage boom in Sweden. Actually, there's another marriage boom going on in Sweden right now, too. The rate of, the number of marriages has gone up by about 36% in the last 6 or 7 years. It's been commented on by Swedish newspapers. Demographers are delighted to now have something new to study. So there's no evidence that marriage by heterosexual couples has been diminished in any way by giving rights to same-sex couples. The divorce rate comparisons pretty much tell you the same story. There's less interesting stuff here. I'll just, there's a paper in the packet that you can see all these tables and charts in more detail. But let me go on to the one that's gotten the most attention, which is non-marital birth rates. Now, you'll see here that the proportion of births to unmarried mothers is quite high in these countries. So we've got 3 countries here just to make it easier to see: the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. Just for comparison purposes, remember in the US, the rate of non-marital births is about 1 in 3. So it's a lot higher in these countries. But what about the timing? Is there any way that we can say that these increased in some sense or increased faster in some sense once these laws were changed? Well, again, here's Denmark, the blue squares, 1989, shows that after a long increase, basically after same-sex couples got the right to registered partnership, it more or less leveled off. Same thing in Norway, same thing in Iceland, which I don't show here. In the Netherlands, we haven't seen that leveling off. But we also don't see any real dramatic differences in these trends in 1998 when registered partnerships were implemented. And actually, marriages were implemented for same-sex couples in 2001. So there's no difference at all there. So it's actually just very hard to make an argument that there's any kind of relationship between the passage of these laws and the beginnings of same-sex couples getting these rights and some dramatic change or any change in heterosexual marriage behavior. By the way, in case you're wondering, most of these children who are born to unmarried parents are actually born to a cohabiting couple. Most of those couples in these countries marry within the first 5 years of those children's lives. So marriage and parenthood are actually still pretty closely connected in Scandinavia. It's just reversed from the old traditional way. Now people get married once they have kids. Okay, so that's behavior. What about attitudes? Well, I have a little new data to try to talk about. There's a big survey that's done every few years called the World Values Survey. Some of you may have heard of this. And they ask people a lot of questions about values. And one of them asks whether people agree with this statement that marriage is an outdated institution. And actually, interestingly enough, very few people actually think that marriage is an outdated institution. If you look at it across countries, I think France and Belgium have the highest rates of agreement, and they're only about 28%. But it's an interesting question to ask. Have people's opinions about marriage changed once same-sex couples all got either exactly the same rights to marry or something very close? So I took a look at this. So for instance, in the Netherlands, what we see is actually over time, more and more people are agreeing with this statement. So it was about 21% in 1990. The next time they did the survey in 99, it was about 25%. So what I did was to compare the increase in the number of people who think marriage is outdated. And I compared it between countries that recognize same-sex partners and those that don't. And it turns out that actually the agreement rose more in the countries that don't allow same-sex couples the right to marry. So we actually see, I think, pretty strong evidence here that there's no kind of overall big change in attitudes in terms of how people are actually even thinking about marriage as a result of giving same-sex couples the right to marry. These changes have happened. There has been an increase in cohabitation. There has been an increase in non-marital births. There is an increase in agreement that marriage is outdated, but it's just same-sex couples who are kind of riding the wave that heterosexual couples were the ones to start. So, a little bit more data just to tell you about some qualitative work that I've done. I interviewed 19 Dutch couples about their decisions to marry or to register as partners or to stay unmarried to see, again, if there's some evidence that there's a difference in marriage behavior. And so first I looked at, what do people say when they say they're going to get married, that why they want to marry. And then I'll talk briefly about how many people actually do get married. So actually, the reasoning that people give about why they marry is very familiar, I think, to people who have mostly studied even heterosexual marriage. People are motivated by commitment. They want to express their commitment to each other, and they want to express it to their family and their friends and their communities. Actually, quite a few of the people I talked to said they wanted to get married because they were about to have children, and that was a very important thing for them, both legally and socially, to be married when they had kids or when they were buying houses. These are all very similar kinds of things that you hear with regard to different sex couples. Some were making a political statement because same-sex marriage is a hot political issue, but no one ever actually said, that's the real reason why I'm marrying. It was always in the context of a relationship that already existed, that was very important to them, and they want to maybe make a political statement alongside the more personal one. They're not marrying for the benefits. You don't actually get a lot of benefits in the Netherlands for marrying, but they do get a legal framework for living your lives together in the Netherlands, as you do in most other countries, where it talks about what happens to property, to your assets, to your kids, if something was to happen to one of the people who was married, or if the marriage ends. Other kinds of things that were particularly important, I'll just skip one of them. They want a choice, not a social obligation. And you might start to say, well, wait a minute, now that sounds a little bit different. But in fact, again, this is the same-sex couples kind of riding the same wave. The new way of looking at marriage in the Netherlands for different sex couples is also to see it as a choice. Many choose not to marry, at least until they've actually had a child. Finally, for all these couples, marriage had a unique value. They did not want registered partnership. They thought it was a good thing. It was a good political compromise, a step along the way. But once they had a choice, and they do now have a choice, they clearly choose getting married. And even those who had registered partnerships before they could get married say, we're married. They don't say we're registered as partners. They say, that sounds like, something an accountant does. No, we're married. So is there any evidence that gay people are going to change marriage when we think about the idea of marriage? Well, maybe a little bit. There is a conscious rejection of gendered roles. I don't think that's going to have a huge effect on marriage as an institution itself, mainly because it's very few couples that we're talking about here. There's an awareness it's a political institution, and they've tried to redefine its meaning to fit with their feminist values in many cases. There is maybe the one side effect is that they noted that you can't really assume in Holland anymore when somebody says they're married, you can't assume that they're heterosexual. So that's the signaling value of marriage, as economists like to talk about it, may have actually changed. Take-up rates are low. Why might that be in Holland? I didn't give you the exact numbers, but they're all pretty small, relatively speaking. The Netherlands is the highest. About a quarter of same-sex couples are either married or registered. Mainly because they've already done work that they needed to do to protect their relationship before a legal option was available to them. They already had wills, they had cohabitation agreements, they got some rights and responsibilities just by living together. They probably are less likely to have kids overall. But mainly, they've worked really hard to achieve recognition for themselves as a couple without the ability to get that legal sanction. And they worry, in many cases, that if they were to marry, that somehow all of the prior meaning of their relationship would be washed away by the act of marrying. So some couples are reluctant to marry because of that, in particular some couples who've been together a long time. Some do, as I noted before, some have political objections to the concept of marriage, but that is changing. And my time is up, but I'm on the last slide. So there's no evidence, I would argue, of any adverse changes in heterosexual marriage behavior. There's no change that we can tie directly to in attitudes, and all the potential changes, I think, are relatively minor that we're talking about compared to the kinds of changes that we've seen in other parts of the law. Thank you.
Lee Badgett has ably responded to Stanley Kurtz's argument that gay marriage is linked to the decline of the institution of marriage in Scandinavia and elsewhere in Europe. As you'll see, in general, I agree with her. With the possible exception of the Netherlands, the statistics here just don't work in Stanley Kurtz's favor. However, there's a deeper problem with his argument, and that is its limited historical context. And that's what I want to discuss. I'm going to be looking specifically at the nation of Sweden here. And in fact, the deliberate deconstruction of marriage in Sweden began over 75 years ago. It was and remains part of an ideological project to socialize broad aspects of economic life through a profound transformation of the family and the home. Now, since 1931, Sweden's political life has been dominated by one party, the Social Democratic Labour Party. It has ruled alone or at the head of a coalition for 66 of the last 75 years. Modern Sweden is this party's project. Prior to the 1930s, Sweden's Social Democrats, like other European socialists, had focused their political energies on conflicts in the factories between workers and owners or capitalists. The new ideological tactic, launched in the early 1930s, sought, in historian Jovan Herdman's words, to smuggle socialist forms into the capitalist society until they finally brought down the entire economic system from the inside. Looking at the same developments, the legal scholar Jacob Sundberg sees, quote, the socialist government in Sweden setting itself a goal perfectly analogous to that which loomed before the Russian Bolsheviks in the 1920s, carry socialism to its logical conclusion in the field of family law. In short, the deliberate political elimination of marriage as a meaningful legal and social institution was far advanced in Sweden before same-sex marriage became an issue. An irony is that this project actually began as part of a campaign to raise Sweden's birth rate. In the time I have, I can only give a brief summary of my historical argument. The paper describes the origin of this agenda among a circle of young Stockholm radicals in the 1930s, and the flowering of their work in a book by a married couple, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, a book entitled Crisis in the Population Question, published in 1934. In order to raise Sweden's birth rate, their combination of feminist and socialist goals would mean the movement of all Swedish women out of their homes, an end to the male breadwinner and female homemaker roles, the new employment of mothers in the collectivized tasks of childcare, early education, meal preparation, and so on. Most other costs of rearing children would also be socialized, that is, become a state responsibility. As the Myrdal summarized, the population question is so transformed into the most effective argument for a thorough and radical socialist remodeling of society. Relative to marriage, these changes would mark a curious decrease in status and function. On the one hand, the Myrdals still praised marriage as the most likely source of larger families. On the other hand, their program would strip marriage of virtually all remaining functions, except procreation. The socialization of almost everything, from infant care to meal preparation, would leave the home as an empty economic shell. Finally, where marriage had once meant the dependency of husband on wife, wife on husband, and children on parents, the new scheme would instead make all adults and all children dependents on the state. Now, my paper traces the retreat of these ideas in Sweden, starting about 1940 and running until 1967 or so, and the consequent and somewhat curious period known as the era of the socialist housewife in Sweden. However, Sweden entered its red years in 1967, running to the fall of the socialist government in 1976. At the heart of these years was a massive gender turn that would further alter the nature of marriage. In 1969, the same Alva Myrdal, who'd written the book in the 1930s, chaired a major panel labeled On Equality for the Social Democrats. Her report concluded that, quote, in the society of the future, the point of departure must be that every adult is responsible for his or her own support. Benefits previously inherited marital status should be eliminated. The report also called for a tax policy based on individual earnings without any preference for any so-called form of cohabitation, which was her new and somewhat deflating term for marriage. Policy changes came fast and furious in these years. Marriage law reforms premised on neutrality toward living arrangements eliminated all important distinctions between marriage and non-marital cohabitation. Tax reforms jettisoned the joint return, embraced individualized taxation, which paid no attention again to marital status, dependence, or the income of a spouse. As one analyst has summarized, this change alone more or less eradicated the traditional home, for it marked the end of marriage as a visible economic partnership. Divorce law reform eliminated fault and made the divorce process essentially unilateral. Gender roles of breadwinner and homemaker were deliberately eliminated, and outside employment became effectively mandatory for all women in their 20s and 30s. Small children moved massively into state-provided daycare. The feminist historian Yvonne Herdman correctly gauges the sweep of change here and the way in which the socialist vision of the Myrdals from the 1930s now took form. She notes that women's work in this new Swedish order had a peculiar quality. In the fields of agriculture and forestry, the number of working women actually declined, while in private industry it grew just a very small amount. However, in the service sector, which in Sweden is mainly governmental, the number of working women rose from about 270,000 in 1950 to 819,000 by 1990. In the education and healthcare sectors, which are exclusively governmental, the number of working women rose nearly threefold, from 282,000 to over 1 million by 1990. Now, in a nation of 8 million people, these are large changes. In short, family policy had been used as a lever to achieve something, quote, truly revolutionary. The shriveling of private homes, resting on marriage, a massive expansion of the state sector as a means of socializing remaining family functions in order to secure economic democracy. As Herdman concludes, new ideas of gender replaced old-fashioned ideas about the couple. We witness here the birth of the androgynous individual, and I speak about the explicit ideal and the death of the provider and his housewife. Again, all of this occurred between 1969 and 1986. It was only in 1987 that the Joint Homes Act appeared. This new measure governed relationships similar to marriage, and it rested on the principle of neutrality toward family form. One novel aspect of this new law was that it applied to both unmarried heterosexual and homosexual couples. Attracting little attention at the time, it should be noted that this latter innovation came near the end of the marital deconstruction project, not at the beginning. Again, why I agree that Stanley Kurtz is not a very reliable guide here. Well, since registered partnerships in Sweden were introduced in 1995, their annual number has varied between 250 and 665. As of 2005, a total of 3,700 Swedish men and women lived together as registered partners. It is true that early in this period, it appeared that the marriage rate was falling. It reached a low of 31,000 in 1998, but the conventional marriage rate, that number began to climb again, reaching 38,000 in 2002. Now, adoption by same-sex couples has also turned out to be, at least in practice, mostly a non-issue in Sweden. While made legal as of February 2003, no such adoptions occurred that year, and only a handful since. Again, the history I've given and the numbers do qualify claims that recognition of same-sex partnerships has damaged marriage in Sweden. The dismantling of the institution had already largely occurred. The thing that is now called marriage in Sweden legally carries little more than a symbolic label. Still, was the introduction of registered partnerships in Sweden in 1995 merely a neutral event? Well, here the answer really depends on how one understands or defines marriage. If marriage is simply a label about intimate relationships, without meaningful historical roots, holding no intrinsic nature, and endlessly variable as an expression of a current culture, then registered partnerships have been, and same-sex marriage would be, just another innovation, accommodating new adult desires and realities. However, if marriage has an intrinsic structure rooted in nature, if marriage is more than a sexual relationship between two people, but one also involving rings of obligation toward potential and actual children, extended family, neighborhood, community, and nation, if marriage exists only when the economic and the sexual are united into one relationship, if marriage has always had a close, if never perfect, bond with procreation and the perpetuation of the human species, and if marriage has a necessary role to play as a guarantor of liberty, as in G.K. Chesterton's words, the only check on the state that is bound to renew itself as eternally as the state and more naturally than the state. If any or all of these claims have validity, then the answer changes. In this latter view, marriage and family law exist to encourage, sustain, and protect this unique institution. Marriage is for the propagation of children and for their conservation through nurture, education, and protection. These tasks, in turn, renew extended families, communities, and nations. Autonomous homes so formed also serve as a sort of bulwark of liberty, a natural rival to the growth of the state. As with the elimination of fault from divorce proceedings, or like the deliberate dismantling of economic bonds between husband and wife, the introduction of registered partnerships and of same-sex marriage, in this view, further confuses and diminishes a vital human institution. In the end, the real debate is over the nature of marriage and of society, which in fact was the debate that Stephanie Kuntz and Lynn Wardle were engaged in earlier. The first model noted above emphasizes variability and change. The second model sees marriage as an institution, universal in its basics. For logical and consistent ideological reasons, Sweden's socialists openly embraced the first model, because conventional marriage stood in the way of their collectivist ambitions. Marriage embodied a rival set of loyalties that prevented emergence of the desired androgynous individual dependent on the central state, loyalties that forestalled the socialization of private life. Now, until recently, American debate over the meaning of marriage has been much more muddled than the debate that took place in Sweden. One positive result of the current U.S. controversy over same-sex marriage is, I believe, to clear the air and to clarify the predictable consequences of decisions soon to be made. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Lee, would you like to respond?
Yeah, actually, yeah. No more PowerPoint. Well, first, it's always nice that we agree on something. I think that that's an important observation to make, that at least with regard to consequences, it sounds like we're more or less agreeing that there aren't any clear-cut consequences related to giving same-sex couples registered partnership rights in Sweden. It's more of an effect than a cause of the kinds of changes that we've actually talked about. But it does seem kind of curious to me, and maybe you're confused, as I sometimes am when I read papers like this, that on one hand we have someone talking about the eradication of marriage or the marital deconstruction project, at the same time that we have continuing use of that institution, and not only that, but occasional resurgences of that institution. And I think what the difference is in this debate is that the kind of marriage that's being eradicated is a particular kind of marriage. It's the male breadwinner, female homemaker model of marriage, a very gendered kind of marriage that no longer fits the kind of marriage that many women want for themselves, many heterosexual women want for themselves. And that is a very different kind of marriage that I think some of us are very happy to see go. Now, the question is, what are the consequences of that? Is there something bad that's happened in Sweden as a result of this? The big concern that people like Stanley Kurtz say they have has to do with the impact on children. Swedish children, though, are actually doing quite well. They have very low infant mortality rates. Once they're older, they have lower homicide rates, lower suicide rates, lower teen pregnancy rates. They have higher test scores. They look like they're doing pretty well despite these kinds of changes in marriage. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that that marriage doesn't necessarily speak particularly well to Swedish couples who are living together. And many of those couples are actually looking a lot like more traditional married couples in the sense that they are very stable. They stay together for a while. Swedish kids spend more of their lives living with both parents than kids in the U.S. do. So it's not clear that these kinds of changes, whether it's changing the laws to allow same-sex couples to have rights or changing the laws to make marriage gender neutral and to give women the same rights in marriage as men, that any of those changes are things that are bad that we should be concerned about. Thank you.
And I'd like to give everybody a